It took just 9 minutes after Jasmine Crockett stood, eyes blazing, and declared J.D. Vance unfit to serve, for something no one in that chamber could have expected to happen. J.D. didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small black USB, and without saying a word, plugged it into the room's master console. Then, silence. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it holds it hostage. A flicker on the monitor, a voice, a name, a date, and then a recording. 42 seconds. No one moved. No one blinked. Some looked at the floor, others at their hands, but not a single person looked at J.D. Vance. And when the screen went black again, the only thing louder than the silence was the question echoing in every mind. What exactly did we just hear? And who was meant to hear it? This story unfolds at the edge between what we know and what we fear might be true. Though names you recognize appear and emotions may feel startlingly real, this is a dramatic interpretation, a fictionalized narrative designed to stir thought, ignite conversation, and honor the deeper truths of power, justice, and the silence between words. Because sometimes what never happened still tells us everything we need to know. Welcome to The Tape That Stopped the Room. So take a breath, lean in, and let this moment unfold. It might just change how you see everything. There are moments in Washington that feel different. The air thickens, the murmurs hush, not because anyone said to be quiet, but because something is about to happen, something that can't be undone. It was 9:02 a.m. when the hearing room reached capacity. Reporters crammed into the press box, elbows touching. Boom mics hovered like vultures over the witness table. The seal of the United States Senate gleamed under cold fluorescent lights. You could smell the tension, sweat, anticipation, fresh printed agendas still warm from the copier. The American Workers' First Act was on the docket, a deceptively named bill with the power to reshape entire industries, gut protections, and shift the economic map beneath working families. Behind the polished oak bench sat senators who'd rehearsed every facial expression, but no one rehearsed for what Jasmine Crockett was about to say. She adjusted her mic slowly, deliberately. The red light blinked to life. "Let's not waste anyone's time," she began, voice smooth but sharp. "Because American workers have had their time wasted, generation after generation, by people in this room." A ripple of discomfort moved through the chamber. Brows furrowed, chairs shifted. Jasmine leaned forward. "Senator J.D. Vance," she said, turning her eyes to him like a spotlight, "doesn't represent the steelworker in Toledo. He doesn't speak for the teacher driving Uber at night to pay rent. He represents corporate donors who wine and dine in rooms with private exits and custom suits." The air changed. Reporters looked up from their notes. A few camera operators zoomed in. J.D. Vance didn't move. Silence. Not defiance. Not indignation. Just stillness. As if his entire strategy was to outlast the moment. Jasmine wasn't finished. "I've read every line of this bill, and do you know what it screams? It screams fear. Fear of the American worker waking up. Fear of them demanding more. This bill doesn't protect workers, it protects profit." The gallery behind the senator stirred. A woman in a nurse's uniform whispered something to the man beside her. Someone in a union jacket squeezed his baseball cap. J.D. Vance slowly folded his hands on the desk. Still no words. Jasmine noticed. "So you won't speak?" she asked. "You'll just sit there and hope I tire myself out? That's how power has always worked, isn't it? Just wait. Wait us out. Starve the moment." Another ripple through the room. This one sharper. Cameras turned. Phones began recording. The moment was no longer just in the room. It was escaping it, spreading. And J.D. still didn't speak. It wasn't cowardice. It wasn't pride. It was something else. Something unreadable. Why wasn't he defending himself? Why wasn't he reacting? Was he waiting? Or was he planning something? The question planted itself in the mind of every person watching. Every journalist, every senator, every viewer at home tuning in. What did J.D. Vance know that no one else did? The silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. Jasmine paused too, just for a beat. Her instincts told her something was off. She was a fighter, yes, but she was also a litigator. And when a man didn't swing back, not even to save his reputation, that meant he wasn't losing. He was setting the stage. Outside, headlines were already forming. Jasmine Crockett opens fire at Vance in heated Senate hearing. Crockett accuses Vance of selling out workers. J.D. Vance silent. But for how long? Inside, the silence held. And then, for the first time that morning, J.D. Vance lifted his eyes, calm, still, and met Jasmine's gaze. He didn't speak, but his fingers tapped once on the leather folder before him. 3 slow taps, as if to say, wait. She was still holding the room when he moved. J.D. Vance didn't say a word. He didn't flinch, but with a calmness that felt almost rehearsed, he reached into his briefcase, a simple black leather case that had been sitting quietly by his chair the entire time, as unnoticed as a paperweight. The gesture was slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that makes people lean in instead of pull back. Jasmine paused mid-sentence. The room watched. He pulled out a small black USB drive. No label, no markings, just plastic and silence. And in that instant, the energy in the chamber shifted again. Not with noise, but with anticipation. Every reporter leaned forward. Every aide turned their eyes. A murmur swept through the back rows like wind before a storm. J.D. didn't look at anyone. He simply plugged the USB into the port beneath the committee's screen. A soft chime confirmed the connection. Then, nothing. Nothing. Until the screen came alive. No image. Just a black background and one single line of text. What you're about to hear was never meant to be public. A chill passed through the room. Jasmine narrowed her eyes. For the first time, she didn't speak. Her instincts kicked in again. Not as a congresswoman this time, but as a lawyer. Something about the wording wasn't theatrical. It was evidentiary. On the screen, the text remained. No motion, no sound, just a void, waiting to be filled. J.D. sat back in his chair, still silent, still unreadable. And that's when the voice began. Not J.D.'s, not Jasmine's. A man's voice, raspy, urgent, and unaware he was being recorded. Look, if we move fast, no one will trace it back to the donors. The language just has to sound pro-labor. We'll bury the real shifts on page 46. Gasps, audible ones. A senator on the left, one who had quietly co-sponsored the bill, shifted uncomfortably. The audio continued. Get J.D. to introduce it. He's clean enough on the surface. They trust him. That's the key. Trust. You earn it, then use it. Quietly. Someone in the gallery covered their mouth. A journalist dropped their pen. Jasmine stared at the screen. Breath held. Her mind raced, calculating. Who was the voice? How did J.D. get this? Why now? But more urgently, what else was on that file? The screen faded to black again. Silence. Then J.D. Vance finally spoke. One sentence. Low, calm, precise. I figured if you were going to question who I serve, Congresswoman, everyone deserved to hear the full story. Not a defense, not a counterattack, an unveiling. The hearing room, just seconds ago, boiling with Jasmine's fire, had turned cold with realization. He hadn't been quiet out of weakness. He'd been waiting, not dodging, setting the fuse. And now something irreversible had been set in motion. For a second, just 1 second, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her hands froze on the edge of the podium, and her gaze locked onto the blank congressional screen like it had personally betrayed her. The screen was black again, but the damage was already done. Her mind spun. Who recorded that call? When? And how in the world did J.D. get it? She had built her argument with facts, fire, and public conviction, only to be blindsided by a whisper from the shadows. Behind her, murmurs rose into a low, chaotic hum. A staffer leaned toward another. Is this even legal? Another voice in the back row, quieter but sharper. That wasn't just a leak. That was a hit job. A beat later, the screen flickered once more. Jasmine turned toward it instinctively, defensive, like someone bracing for a second blow. The voice returned, this time clearer, colder, calculated. The American worker isn't the priority anymore. Let's be real. There it was, the sentence that would echo far beyond the marble columns of the hearing room. The sentence that would be clipped, looped, dissected, and burned into news cycles by midnight. The reaction was instant. Someone in the gallery gasped audibly. Another covered their mouth. Even among seasoned journalists, people who had heard scandal after scandal, there was a collective shiver. Jasmine's breathing grew shallow. She wasn't rattled by JD's theatrics. No, that wasn't it. What struck her was the familiarity in the voice. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone close to the legislation, someone with real access. And if what they said was true, the bill she had prepared to eviscerate publicly might have been corrupt at its core all along. Her role had shifted in real time, from accuser to witness. JD still sat, motionless. The smug detachment he wore earlier was gone, replaced now by something almost eerie: restraint, control. A man who knew the room had already crossed a line it couldn't walk back from. Cameras clicked wildly. Phones buzzed. One senator, older, weary-looking, stood up and muttered, "I didn't sign up for this circus," before leaving the chamber. The chairman called for order, banging the gavel once, twice, 3 times. But order was gone. The clip continued and the voice spoke again, layering on the weight of its indifference. "Once the unions sign off, we push it through. Doesn't matter if they've read it. It's politics, optics." This time Jasmine flinched. She had fought bills like this before, had dismantled backroom games, but hearing it spoken so brazenly, so proudly was different. It wasn't politics as usual. It was a confession wrapped in strategy, a glimpse behind the curtain that, once seen, could never be unseen. For a moment she didn't know whether to respond or listen, and the crowd noticed. America noticed. Because Jasmine Crockett, the woman known for commanding the floor with fierce certainty, now stood in rare and heavy silence. Not defeated, not lost, but recalculating. And across from her sat J.D. Vance, hands folded, face unreadable. Was he a whistleblower, an opportunist, a pawn in a larger game, or the one who had just flipped the entire board? The hearing was no longer about just the American workers' first act. It was now about exposure. And Jasmine knew. What happened next wouldn't just define this session, it would define the very people sitting in that room, on that day, under those lights. The room, already shaken, now braced for more. The screen remained dark, but the voices, calm, polished and damning, poured through the speakers like poison in a well. It was a private conversation, recorded behind closed doors, clearly never intended for daylight. 2 men, one with the clipped cadence of power, the other smooth and accented. At first, their identities were murky, until the names slipped. "Listen, Marco," the CEO's voice said, "we're not asking you to kill the bill outright. Just slow it down. You want fewer protections? Pay up," came the senator's reply. "I'll make it disappear in subcommittee." The words didn't echo. They detonated. The name Marco wasn't vague. It was unmistakable. Senator Marco Henley, a high-ranking member of the Commerce Committee, long rumored to be untouchable. And the other voice? While the man wasn't named, the accent and corporate jargon gave him away to anyone who had followed international labor politics. Victor Kovac, CEO of the foreign logistics conglomerate Zentech Global. Silence didn't follow. It exploded. Reporters surged forward. Phones were already out. Aides fumbled with earpieces, whispering frantically into comms. One woman in the gallery, a factory worker from Ohio who'd flown in to watch the hearing, clutched her chest and began to cry. Not out of fear, out of realization. She had come to support the American workers' first act, believing it could protect her job from being outsourced. Now she was watching, live, as her dignity was bartered in a sentence. Jasmine Crockett's expression shifted. Gone was the initial shock. In its place, a rising storm. She took one step forward, gripping the table edge. her eyes fixed on the screen as if willing it to say more. It did. The unions, Henley scoffed on tape. We'll throw them a bone. Some made in America, ribbon-cutting nonsense. They'll smile for the cameras. Meanwhile, your shipment quotas keep moving through Mexico. A wave of gasps swept the room, not from outrage alone, but from recognition. These weren't empty threats. These were coordinated betrayals wrapped in legislative language. One congressman tried to stand and object, but the chairman raised a hand. "Let it finish," he said quietly. And so it did. The tape closed with a chilling line from Victor. "Good. We want loyalty, not labor rights." Then silence. No music, no fade out, just the raw, mechanical click of the recording ending. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The room had gone beyond noise. It had stopped breathing. Even J.D. Vance, who had unleashed the USB, sat stone still, absorbing the full scope of what he had just revealed. Jasmine finally turned to face the chamber. "This isn't about one bill anymore," she said, voice low but steady. "This is about who we are when no one's watching." Her words weren't rhetorical. They were a verdict, one that would linger in headlines and dinner tables across America for weeks to come. The weight of the silence was unbearable. It pressed into every seat, crept under every collar, and left the air dense with unspoken questions. Then J.D. Vance finally rose. Not dramatically, not defiantly, but with a restraint that made it all the more unsettling. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't adjust his tie. He just looked straight ahead, and in a voice both quiet and unshakably clear, he said, "I didn't come here to win popularity. I came here to end backroom betrayals. No theatrics, no apology, just that one carved sentence." The room didn't erupt. It inhaled. Jasmine Crockett turned to him, her sharp gaze betraying a flicker of something unexpected. Not anger, not contempt. Confusion. Maybe even the beginning of understanding. Her stance softened by a fraction, but she said nothing. "Not yet." J.D. continued. "You've all seen the tape. Some of you already knew. Most of you suspected. And the rest? You've spent years pretending not to." His words weren't shouted, but they landed like hammer blows. Eyes lowered. A few heads turned away. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their silence more telling than any denial. This isn't just about a single senator. This is about the machinery that's been running this place while Americans beg for basic dignity. He let the words settle before adding quietly, "And I'm done pretending I don't hear the gears grinding them down." Cameras blinked. Reporters scribbled furiously, but none of them interrupted. No one dared to. J.D. reached into his jacket and produced a simple folder, unmarked, beige, heavy with implication. He didn't open it. He just held it up, his hand steady. "There's more," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Names, dates, conversations, lobbyist trails that end where your votes began." Gas rippled again, not from the public gallery this time, but from the committee table itself. A veteran senator leaned over and whispered something to her aide. Another reached for his phone, hands trembling ever so slightly. But J.D. wasn't finished. "You don't have to like me. Frankly, I wouldn't if I were you. I've been silent too long, but silence is consent, and today I withdraw mine." That last line struck deep. Jasmine blinked. Once. Slowly. This wasn't the man she thought she was debating. He wasn't playing a partisan game anymore. He had changed the rules, or maybe broken the table entirely, and he was still speaking. The American Workers' First Act was supposed to protect people. People like my father, who welded steel in Youngstown until they shipped his job overseas. People like my neighbor who died from a second job injury because they cut corners to save on insurance. He paused, not to dramatize, but because the next line cost him something to say. We lost more than paychecks. We lost pride. And while we argued over slogans, they sold our future wholesale. Now even Jasmine felt the tightness in her throat. This wasn't performance, it was confession, veined with fire. He looked straight into the camera, not at the press, at the public. "You've been loyal. You've worked hard. You've waited. This is me finally showing up for you." With that, he returned to his seat. No fist pounding, no applause, just a kind of sacred stillness, as if the hearing had shifted from politics to penance. Jasmine turned away, swallowing hard. This wasn't over. Not even close. But something irreversible had begun. It didn't take long for the walls of Congress to echo far beyond Washington. Within hours, cable news networks broke into regular programming. CNN led with the Chiron. Vance exposes congressional corruption? MSNBC's banner was more cautious. Unauthorized leak or heroic whistleblower? And over on Fox News, the tone darkened. J.D. Vance betrays his base. Clips from the hearing replayed on a loop, especially the moment the screen went black, and J.D.'s voice filled the chamber. Memes flooded Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. Freeze frames of Jasmine's stunned face, J.D.'s hand holding the USB, the words "this was never meant to be public" plastered over slow-motion edits, layered with cinematic music and hashtags. By 7 p.m., hashtag USBgate trended #1 nationwide. By 8:15, it went global. News anchors scrambled to secure panelists, former senators, constitutional lawyers, retired intelligence agents. Some praised J.D. as the conscience of a broken chamber. Others called for his censure. One commentator on a right-wing talk show furiously declared, "He just handed our enemies a blueprint for division." But what rattled the most was the ambiguity. No one could definitively say whether the recording had been doctored, whether J.D. had broken the law, whether the folder in his hands actually held the evidence he claimed. It didn't matter. The court of public opinion had already convened and was deeply, violently split. In Ohio, where J.D.'s base once stood rock solid, diners erupted into debates. In South Dakota, a former union leader called into a radio show in tears. In Queens, a community organizer streamed a late-night reaction with the caption, "Did J.D. Vance just risk everything for us?" For Jasmine, it meant something else entirely. By midnight, her team was fielding dozens of interview requests, but she accepted none. Instead, she sat alone in her office, watching the clip of J.D.'s speech one more time. Not for facts, for tone, for truth, for any sign that this wasn't just strategy cloaked in sincerity. She didn't yet know what disturbed her more. The possibility that J.D. had turned on his own party, or the fact that, somewhere deep down, part of her respected it. And across the country, the American people weren't waiting for verdicts. They were reacting. At 2:12 a.m., a single Facebook post went viral. It wasn't flashy, no video, no meme, just a profile picture of a middle-aged man in a welding helmet, posted from a phone still marked with grease. He wrote, "I've worked 37 years, lost my pension, lost my wife to medical bills. I watched every promise disappear while these folks shook hands behind closed doors. I don't care if it's J.D. or Jasmine or anyone else. He spoke for me. For the first time, someone finally did." By sunrise, his words had been shared over 300,000 times. And for the first time in years, the American worker wasn't just a political talking point. They were listening. The news anchors were still speaking over each other when the camera cut away. But inside J.D.'s mind, the noise had already gone silent. The halls of Congress had become echoes. Jasmine Crockett's eyes still lingered on him, uncertain, flickering with an unfamiliar doubt. But J.D. wasn't looking back anymore. Not at her, not at anyone. He was somewhere else, some other year, somewhere colder. A December wind howled through the rust-eaten frame of a 1991 Ford pickup. Inside, a 10-year-old J.D. Vance curled up in the passenger seat, his knees drawn to his chest, his breath clouding against the window. The vinyl seat was cracked, stiff, and smelled like oil and stale tobacco. His socks were wet, his fingers numb. His mother had said she'd be back in 20 minutes. It had been 4 hours. He remembered counting the blinking red digits on the old dashboard clock again and again, as if they might give him a different answer this time. But they didn't. They never did. The world outside the truck was an Ohio town asleep under thin ice, where no one cared that a boy was shivering behind fog glass, praying silently that the keys weren't still in the ignition. Not because he'd drive off, but because someone else might. Then came a soft rap on the frosted window. J.D. flinched, his breath catching. Outside stood a man in dark blue overalls, shoulders dusted with snow, face lined and tired. A janitor by the look of him. He gestured for JD to unlock the door. Hesitating for only a second, JD did. "Didn't mean to scare you," the man said gently. "I clean up at the diner across the street. Saw you sitting here too long." JD couldn't find words, only nodded. The man scanned the inside of the truck, put two and two together faster than JD expected. He disappeared for a moment, then returned with a folded coat, gray, wool, heavy, too big for a boy. "Take this," he said, handing it over. "Ain't new, but it's warm. Warmer than what you got." JD reached for it slowly, cautiously, like it might vanish. He wrapped it around himself and immediately felt his shaking lessen. The man squatted beside the open door. His voice dropped to something more personal. "Stay warm, kid," he whispered. "The world's colder than this truck, but it don't mean you have to freeze." Then he stood and walked off without another word, disappearing into the snow-slick night. JD never saw him again, but he remembered the weight of that coat, the way it felt like armor. And now, 20-some years later, sitting under blinding congressional lights and media firestorms, JD Vance carried that memory like a quiet fire inside. That was the night he learned survival wasn't a solo act, that decency sometimes came from unexpected hands, and that silence didn't always mean weakness. So when the nation asked whether he was a traitor or a truth-teller, when Jasmine Crockett narrowed her eyes and the press salivated, JD didn't answer with noise. He answered with the kind of fire that begins in silence, and that fire had just begun to burn. The next morning, JD left Washington before sunrise. No press conference, no entourage, just one duffel bag and the coat he'd kept for 20 years, now tailored to fit a man who hadn't forgotten what it meant to be cold. He drove 6 hours west, past glass towers and gated communities, into the forgotten bones of a country no longer televised. The roads narrowed, signs rusted, the air turned heavier, but oddly familiar. He didn't need GPS to find it. His gut knew every turn. It was a town like many others, where the last factory had shut down before some of its workers were even born. The place smelled like wood smoke and old diesel. Half the windows were boarded. The welcome sign hadn't been repainted in over a decade. JD parked across from a corner diner that looked exactly as it had when he first passed through on Campaign Trail 3 years earlier. He opened the door to a soft chime. The waitress behind the counter froze. It took her a moment, then she whispered, not quite believing her eyes, "You remembered us." JD nodded once. No big speech, no need. She didn't ask what he wanted to eat. She just poured black coffee and pointed him to the back booth. Same one he'd sat in last time, back when promises came easier. Word spread quickly, not in headlines, but through lived eyes. Within 20 minutes, 4 factory workers walked in, then 2 more, a retired teacher, a young man who'd just been laid off from the steel yard and hadn't told his father yet. They gathered not like constituents greeting a senator, but like people entering a room with something sacred unspoken between them. JD didn't speak at first. He just listened. One man described how his wife's insulin now cost more than their rent. Another showed photos of a daughter who'd moved 3 states away because there were no jobs left here. A third clenched his fists as he talked about the opioids still flooding the county, decades after the crackdown began. JD wrote notes on a small pad. He didn't interrupt. He didn't posture. He didn't say, "I understand," because he knew he never truly could. Not all of it. But he did know what it felt like to fall asleep hungry, to fear winter, to watch your mother break and not be able to fix her. When a young mother with tired eyes whispered, "We just want to be seen," JD didn't offer applause or slogans. He looked her in the eye and said, "You are." The room held still for a moment, the kind of stillness that lives between heartbreak and hope. Then slowly conversation returned. People shared, laughed, even cried. JD stayed for hours, refusing interviews but asking questions, real ones. Not about polling numbers, but about broken roofs, school lunches, bus schedules, clinic hours. When he finally stood to leave, the sun was dipping below the rooftops. The waitress handed him a bag of leftover cornbread wrapped in foil. "Keep warm," she said. "It's cold out." JD paused. The weight of her words wasn't lost on him. He stepped outside and pulled the coat tighter around his shoulders. It wasn't just memory anymore. It was purpose. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the pain inside him sharpen into something useful, not as a weapon, but as a compass. By the next dawn, JD stood alone outside a building, no longer on any map of ambition. The bricks were the same, though dulled by time and rain. The rusted chain-link fence hung crooked, like the spine of something forgotten. His childhood school had not closed officially. It had simply been left behind, hallway by hallway, until the bell stopped ringing altogether. The front door creaked like it remembered him. Inside, paint peeled in long strips like old wallpaper, in a dream you don't want to return to. The floors, once buffed daily, now bore the soft crunch of time. JD's footsteps echoed through empty corridors as if they were asking, "Why now?" He didn't answer. Room 104 still had faint outlines of alphabet charts where tape had long since given up. The broken blinds let in narrow bands of morning light, dust dancing inside them like whispers of kids who never got the chances he did. He kept walking, past rooms where he once ate free lunch, where he memorized the names of dead presidents and tried not to fall asleep from hunger. At the far end of the hallway was the boiler room, still there, still heavy with the smell of old oil and metal. JD stopped in front of the door. His throat tightened. No campaign speech, no policy memo, no television spotlight had ever brought him back here. Just memory. Mounted beside the boiler room door was a small plaque. Nothing fancy, just brass on wood. But the name etched there hit him like gravity. Mr. Ellison James, custodian. 1984 to 2001. He kept us warm. JD reached out and touched the name. A long breath escaped his lips, as if it had been held since that winter night decades ago in the truck. The same name. The same man who had slipped him a coat and told him to survive a world that wouldn't ask his name until it needed his vote. He whispered to no one, to everyone, "I'm still that boy, just with a microphone now." The silence didn't respond, but something settled in JD's chest. Not peace, but a reckoning. As if part of him had been carrying this room all along and hadn't realized it until now. He left the plaque untouched but not unmarked. When he stepped out into the sunlight again, the wind felt sharper. Not cruel, just real. Miles away, back in the Capitol, Jasmine Crockett sat in the back seat of a black government SUV, her eyes locked on the screen of her phone. Cable news was cycling JD's latest stop in the Midwest, an unannounced return to his childhood school. The anchor's voice floated between static and sincerity. Where he honored the janitor who once gave him a coat when he was homeless. JD Vance says he owes his voice to a man who spoke only through acts of quiet dignity. Jasmine blinked. Once. Twice. She wasn't sure what she was feeling. Her fingers tightened slightly on the phone. This wasn't the JD she had faced in the hearing room. This wasn't the political foil she'd prepared speeches against. This was someone else. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but said nothing. The car kept moving. Outside her window, the city passed in blurred lines and blinking lights. But inside, something had shifted. Not an opinion, not an alliance. Just a weightless hesitation. A crack in the wall she'd built to keep her enemies at arm's length. And though she didn't know it yet, this moment, this one breath between doubt and clarity, was where everything would begin to change. It didn't take long. Less than 48 hours after the tape aired and the janitor's plaque went viral, the counterattack began. In marble hallways where handshakes were currency, JD Vance was suddenly untouchable. And not in the way people admired. He walked through the Capitol like a ghost, and the silence he passed through wasn't respect, it was recoil. Senator Morrison, who'd once praised JD's fresh honesty, called him a liability on national television. Senator Wexler, known for speeches about bipartisanship, leaked to the press that JD had violated norms of decorum and legal restraint. Anonymous sources inside committees floated the idea that ethics charges were being drafted, not for the people on the tape, but for the man who exposed them. By the end of the week, his inbox was a battleground. Corporate PACs that once funneled quiet checks to his campaign sent one-line emails with cold finality. Effective immediately, we are suspending all contributions. One by one, doors that had once cracked open with a nod were now slammed shut without explanation. He was no longer useful. He was dangerous. But something strange happened beneath the wreckage. Mixed in with the venom, emails calling him a traitor, envelopes with no return address and crude threats, were voices JD hadn't heard in years. Real voices, from real places. A handwritten letter arrived in blue ink, shaky and sprawling. Mr. Vance, my father worked 38 years at the Ohio steel plant. He died with bad lungs and no pension. I watched your hearing. I just wanted to say thank you for remembering we're still here. Marie L., Youngstown. Another came typed on a typewriter, complete with smudged keys and crooked alignment. Dear Senator, I fought in 2 wars and came back to find a country I barely recognize. You spoke like someone who hasn't forgotten who pays the real price. Don't stop. Don't you dare stop. Sergeant Allen P., retired, Iowa. They arrived by the dozens, then hundreds. Envelopes postmarked from battered towns, rusted counties, forgotten corners. Some included photos of tired hands, union cards for closed homes. One envelope held only a rusted button from a steelworker's overalls and the note, he didn't live to see this, but he would have smiled. JD kept them all. He no longer slept much. The Capitol felt heavier now, like it had learned his name not to uplift it, but to crush it. Staffers began asking if he wanted to keep security close. His office walls, once lined with neat legislative whiteboards, now bore thumbtacked letters from veterans, factory workers, and teachers. When he looked at them, he didn't feel safe, but he did feel anchored. And all the while, Jasmine Crockett watched in silence. From the gallery of headlines and morning shows, she observed the storm circling JD like vultures over a man who had dared to bleed where others wore armor. She wasn't ready to name her thoughts yet, wasn't sure if what she felt was suspicion, admiration, or the first tremor of something else. But she noticed. In committee meetings, she caught colleagues whispering, wondering aloud if JD was spiraling, or worse, becoming something they couldn't predict. She didn't join the whispers. She didn't defend him either. She just listened more carefully, watched more closely. It was the first time in a long time she didn't trust her own certainty. And deep down, though she hadn't admitted it, a question began to form, one that grew louder each time a new headline appeared. Was he reckless, or was he right? She didn't say anything publicly. Not yet. Not when the Sunday shows paraded panels calling JD a rogue operator. Not when op-eds accused him of manufacturing drama for relevance. Not even when a few allies, privately and with caution, asked her to maybe go on record just to reinforce your own stance. She told them she needed time, but the truth was more complicated than time. Late at night, when the Hill quieted and her staff had gone home, Jasmine sat alone in her office, the lights dim, the chaos of the past week dimmer still. On her laptop screen sat the full audio file, JD's now infamous leak. She hadn't listened to the unedited version until now, not all the way through. She clicked play. The room filled with the gravelly tones of high office, with laughter far too casual, too corrupt. A senator joked about how nobody reads subcommittee minutes anyway. A CEO, one she recognized from recent fundraisers, outlined in clinical detail the cost of neutering labor protections. Jasmine leaned forward, brows furrowed. There was no melodrama in the tape, no flashy confessions, just calm calculation. Cold deals, the ease of betrayal wrapped in bureaucracy. Her fingers hovered near the pause button more than once, but she never pressed it. When the final words faded into silence, Jasmine didn't move right away. She simply sat, hands clasped, eyes scanning the city lights beyond her window. Something in her stomach turned. Not revulsion exactly, not yet, but it was the beginning of a fracture, a soft crack in certainty. She opened her drawer and pulled out a stack of unopened letters. Her team screened most of them, but they'd flagged a few as emotional or potentially high impact. That was staffer speak for, tread carefully, it's from someone real. She chose one at random, no return address, but the postmark read Detroit. The letter inside was brief, handwritten in tight cursive on worn paper. Congresswoman Crockett, I have 3 jobs and 1 daughter. She's 9. I used to tell her to trust the system, to believe in the work people like you do. But after that hearing, I don't know who's lying anymore. I really don't. But that tape, that felt like truth. Do what you need to do. Just don't pretend we didn't hear it. Sharon H., Detroit. Jasmine read it twice, then a third time. She folded the letter with care and placed it back in the envelope, her thumb tracing the edge of the paper, as if trying to absorb the weight of the words. That night she didn't sleep much. She kept hearing the line. That felt like truth. The phrase haunted her more than any accusation, more than any memo on ethics violations or calls from fundraisers asking if she still supported J.D. Vance. Because Jasmine had always prided herself on clarity, on being able to tell the difference between performance and conviction. But what if this wasn't about J.D. at all? What if the real problem was that the tape didn't feel like politics? It felt like someone finally cracked open the walls and let the country eavesdrop. The next morning, she declined a network interview, said she needed to attend to constituent correspondence. But all she did was close her door and replay the tape one more time. She wrote nothing, said nothing, just listened. Because something inside her, something long buried beneath years of campaigns, caucus meetings, and compromise, was beginning to stir. Not anger, not ambition, doubt. And it was louder than she expected. By the end of the week, the story had shifted. Cable anchors who once speculated whether JD's leak was a political stunt now had a new angle to chase. His past. Opposition research teams, silent during the explosion, were suddenly humming with activity. Documents began circulating online. Screenshots of old finance disclosures, donations flagged with red circles, PAC affiliations from his earliest campaign. They didn't accuse him of breaking the law, not directly, but implication did the work that evidence couldn't. Nothing illegal doesn't mean nothing suspicious, one commentator said on air, eyebrows raised. The implication stuck. At first, Jasmine only caught glimpses. She heard a staffer mention an article from The Intercept, another from a think tank blog in D.C. Her phone buzzed more often with new press inquiries. Does this change your view on the leak? Is J.D. still credible after this? She answered none of them. Instead, she turned to the tape. Not the politics around it, not the coverage. The tape itself. She had it broken down minute by minute. Not forensics, but something deeper. Linguistic mapping. She knew people who specialized in these things. Voice pattern experts. Political operatives who lived off whispered networks and subtext. It wasn't official, not yet, but she was building a file of her own, because something had begun gnawing at her, not about JD's motives, but about the voice. The second one, the CEO. There was something too comfortable in the cadence, something too familiar in the laughter. Jasmine had spent years in hearings, on panels, at galas and boardroom briefings. People thought the problem with power was money, but it wasn't. It was voice. The way the powerful forgot to be careful when they believed no one was listening. That was where the truth leaked. She played the recording again and again in headphones now, alone, until one moment made her sit up. You want fewer protections? Pay up. I'll make it disappear in subcommittee. The sentence, so matter-of-fact, so bored, sounded less like criminal intent and more like an old habit. Someone who'd done this before? She forwarded the clip to one of her legal aides. Quietly, no chain of command. Tell me what you hear, she wrote. Meanwhile, a headline scrolled across her muted television screen. Vance faces scrutiny for old donors. Critics question reform motive. The noise was mounting, but underneath, in quieter rooms, people were beginning to say different things. She was in the elevator late that night when one of her younger staffers stepped in, clutching a folder thick with constituent letters. He looked hesitant, like he'd been rehearsing. I read through all of them, he said, not looking up. The letters, I mean, about J.D. Jasmine waited. Most of them aren't mad at him. Not really. They're mad at everything else. And now, I don't know, Congresswoman. I thought he was the distraction. But what if he's not the problem? She turned, surprised. The staffer finally met her gaze. What if he's the alarm? The elevator chimed. Her floor. She didn't answer, didn't nod, but she held the silence just long enough for it to mean something. Back in her office, she looked again at the campaign finance leak, spreadsheets and talking points ready to go. It would have been easy, a statement, a tweet, a press release wrapped in righteousness. That was the job, but Jasmine didn't reach for her phone. Instead, she reached for the tape again. The truth wasn't louder now, it was quieter, and somehow harder to ignore. The envelope came with no warning. It was a plain, faded thing, off-white and soft at the corners, worn like it had been carried through years rather than miles. JD almost missed it in the pile of briefings and subpoenas stacked on his desk. No return address. Just a faint, familiar script. To JD from Pap. For a moment he didn't move. His staffer poked in, mentioning something about the next subcommittee response. He waved him off, eyes fixed on the letter. It had the weight of something ancient, not just in age, but in meaning. He turned it over slowly, the way people handle fragile things they didn't know they were still allowed to hold. His grandfather had been gone nearly 6 years. The old man had lived in a weather-worn house deep in McDowell County, West Virginia, long since collapsed in both roof and memory. He hadn't left much behind. A flannel coat that still smelled like coal dust, a dented toolbox, and a voice that lived somewhere in JD's spine, still able to straighten it when needed. The letter wasn't typed. The ink was smudged in places, as though written by a hand that had started to tremble. Still, every word was clear. If you're reading this, then you finally did it. You made it into that place that always felt like it belonged to somebody else. But don't let the walls fool you, JD. They're not stronger than your word. Keep it, even when the room wants you to lose it. JD swallowed. There were no politics in the letter. No talk of bills or parties or strategy. Just a man who'd worked 50 years underground, writing to a boy he once raised on stories and silence. The kind of silence that meant love when words failed. You'll be tempted to shout, but it's when you speak low and clear that they'll know you mean it. And remember, just because something's written down doesn't make it true. Find your truth. Speak it slow. That's the only fight you're meant to win. It wasn't advice, not really. More like a reminder of who he was before cameras and microphones and chaos. A reminder of the porch where they used to sit, watching rain hit rusted gutters. Of the afternoons when nothing needed to be said. He leaned back in his chair. Outside, Washington was boiling. Protesters gathered at the Capitol steps. The network buzzards circled. Another leaked tape was rumored. More accusations. Another senator had called for his censure. But for one rare moment, JD didn't feel like a man on fire. He felt like a grandson holding a match that had once lit the only stove in a house with no insulation. And somehow that warmth returned to his fingers. He folded the letter, placed it in the inner pocket of his blazer. There were meetings to attend, votes to strategize, reporters to dodge. But when he stepped outside that office, he didn't walk like a man defending himself anymore. He walked like someone who knew the ground he came from. The next morning, JD's staff handed him another envelope. This one newer, crisp, and folded neatly in a blue-line card. The return address was from a VA hospital in Ohio. He nearly set it aside until he noticed the note scribbled on the outer flap. Tell him it's from someone who remembers how silence once saved lives. Curious and cautious, JD opened it. The handwriting was angular and clean, as if carved with discipline. The message was long but deliberate, heavy with the weight of decades. Senator Vance, I watched your speech. And more than that, I heard it. That's rare these days. Most only aim for sound bites. You didn't raise your voice. You raised a flag, quietly, and some of us saluted it before we even knew why. JD paused, the letter already pressing into him like a weight. My name's Bernard Kinsey. I'm 94. I served in the 761st Tank Battalion, what they called the Black Panthers. Not the kind folks protested with later. We were just a segregated unit in France, driving into fire so others didn't have to. They told us to be quiet too. Told us history wouldn't remember us if we didn't make a fuss. And maybe it didn't, but we remembered ourselves. He could feel the old man's breath between lines, as if each word took effort to carry, but none were wasted. I've seen brave men scream and cowards whisper, so don't let them confuse volume with virtue. The strongest men in Washington aren't the loudest. They're the ones who speak when no one else dares. I saw it in 1945 when one white captain risked court-martial to stop a lynching outside a French town. He didn't shout. He simply said, "Not on my watch." That was enough. That's still enough, if the words are true. JD found himself gripping the paper harder than necessary. It wasn't just a compliment, it was a commission. This town's rotten in ways people can't always see. Some rot doesn't show on the outside. It's hidden behind polished boots and shiny committee pins. But it's there. And you did something sacred last week. You told the truth out loud. And maybe that truth was ugly. Maybe it'll cost you. But the boys I buried in Belgium didn't die for senators to lie easy. They died so someone, anyone, might one day stand up and mean what they say. JD leaned back, the sounds of the Capitol muted behind his thoughts. He imagined this Bernard Kinsey sitting in a quiet room somewhere, IV drip attached to his arm, watching C-SPAN like it was the front line again. Maybe it was. You don't need to respond, but if you're wondering whether that tape mattered, whether the silence you broke meant anything, know this. Some of us are still listening, even now, even when most aren't. It was signed in block letters. B. Kinsey, Sergeant, retired. U.S. Army, 1943 to 1946. J.D. folded the letter carefully. It didn't belong to the noise of press briefings or political fodder. It belonged in the same pocket as his grandfather's words, a pocket that now felt like armor. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. More fallout, no doubt. More spin. But today he had something the headlines couldn't touch. Across town, Jasmine was just beginning to cross the line between suspicion and listening. And in a quiet room on the east side of Detroit, a mother held her son's hand and said, "Baby, I think someone in Washington finally remembers who we are." The letter found her the next morning. It had been slid into her folder by an aide with no explanation, tucked between committee updates and speech drafts. At first, she barely glanced at it. Another veteran story, another constituent voice. But then she saw the handwriting, old-fashioned, firm, pressed into the page like someone had lived a lifetime in each stroke. She sat down, shut her office door, and began to read. The words didn't shout. They resonated. They pulsed with a quiet authority that could only come from someone who had watched history break open and still believed in healing. Jasmine read about tanks in Europe, the silence of sacrifice and the roar of integrity disguised as restraint. The letter didn't ask for political sides. It asked for truth. And it didn't mention JD's name until the very end. He didn't grandstand. He bore witness. If we've come to a place where that's controversial, then the shame isn't his. It's ours. Her breath caught. The words undid her, not in the way outrage or embarrassment did, but like a key turning inside a lock she didn't know she'd been guarding. She stared at the page for several minutes after finishing, her hand resting on the line that read, "We remembered ourselves." That was what it was, wasn't it? JD hadn't tried to win. He hadn't tried to conquer her. He wasn't positioning himself for power. He was remembering something, and in doing so, forcing them all to remember too. For weeks now, Jasmine had been calculating, holding her cards close, waiting for a mistake. She'd assumed the tape was part of a performance, that JD was manipulating a larger game. But this letter, wasn't strategy. It was memory, and memory was sacred. She rose from her chair and walked out into the hallway. Her staff trailed behind her with questions, but she raised a hand. Not now. In the center meeting room, her senior aides were gathered, running numbers, prepping statements, tracking blowback. They looked up when she entered, waiting for her to speak. She didn't pace. She didn't lecture. She simply stood by the window, the Capitol dome gleaming in the distance, and said evenly, "We're not fighting him anymore." A pause, confusion. "We're not attacking Vance. Not until we finish tracing the voices on that tape. We follow the facts now, wherever they lead." Someone started to object. "But Congresswoman, if we drop the pressure, he controls the narrative." She turned. Her voice didn't rise, but it struck with finality. "This isn't a narrative. This is a warning. And we're either going to respond like leaders or we're just another layer of the problem. That was it. No debate. No further explanation. She left the room before the silence could fill. Down the hall, she moved past portraits of lawmakers long gone, faces framed in confidence, captured mid-century, etched with legacies both noble and forgotten. Jasmine didn't look at them. Her eyes were inward now, scanning something quieter. She moved through corridors as if retracing steps she hadn't yet taken. Marble echoed beneath her heels, the late afternoon sun casting long bars of light across the polished floor. A janitor wheeled a cart past her without making eye contact, but something about the moment made her stop. She thought of JD as a boy. She thought of the coat, of the cold truck, of the janitor who'd whispered warmth into a child's fear. She thought of the tape, the voice, the power, the rot. And she thought of the letter, still folded in her pocket like a heartbeat she couldn't ignore. Alone now, Jasmine walked slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. She had no words, no headline, no plan, just questions, and for the first time, no resistance to where they might lead. By morning, the internet had caught fire. It started with a quiet clip, just 30 seconds long, posted by a high school civics teacher in Ohio. JD's voice echoed through her classroom speakers, calm but firm. "I didn't come here to win popularity. I came here to end backroom betrayals." She'd captioned it simply. My students paused. Then they asked if he was the first real one. Within the hour, the video had over 100,000 views. By noon, a veteran from Michigan stitched it into his own post. Gray-bearded, sitting in a worn recliner with his dog curled up behind him, he looked into the camera and said, "I don't care if you like his politics. That man speaks like someone who saw war and learned peace." He ended his video with a single phrase, "Truth is patriotic." That phrase caught like dry grass in wind. Within minutes, it had a hashtag, #truth is patriotic. A farmer in Iowa, standing ankle-deep in mud with a JD cap tilted sideways, posted a photo with the words scrawled across a cardboard sign and held it next to his tractor. A nurse in Atlanta used the hashtag over a clip of herself watching JD's tape during a night shift break. "We're exhausted," she wrote, "but this gave me a breath of fresh resolve." Soon the phrase wasn't just text. It was printed on signs at town hall meetings, spray-painted on abandoned buildings in Flint, chalked on sidewalks by high school seniors in Tulsa who'd never watched C-SPAN before in their lives. The internet had taken the tape and made it scripture. Not because they believed JD was perfect, but because, somehow, his imperfections made the words matter more. Then came the second wave. #the tape began trending worldwide. It wasn't just pundits anymore. It was plumbers, veterans, single mothers, bus drivers, factory workers, teachers, fishermen, barbers, soldiers, bartenders. People who had stopped believing in anyone with a microphone now found themselves listening on repeat. Cable news scrambled to keep up. CNN ran it as a top headline, "The tape that won't die." Fox News called it a calculated gamble or a gut punch of truth. MSNBC ran a split screen between JD's speech and Jasmine Crockett walking the Capitol halls alone, captioned simply, "Two figures, one reckoning." There were breakdowns, analyses, think pieces, but they were all chasing something rawer than commentary, conviction. Meanwhile, the original 30-second clip had grown legs. Users edited it into reels. One matched it with footage of coal miners clapping dirt from their hands, another with clips of veterans folding flags, another with marching teachers protesting budget cuts in Kentucky. JD's voice was the thread that ran through them all, and underneath it all, a simple truth began to surface in comment after comment, pinned tweet after tweet. He didn't tell us what to believe. He reminded us we already knew. Not everyone agreed. There were critics, loud ones, accusations of manipulation, claims he was faking humility, staging vulnerability. But those voices were beginning to sound like noise at the edges of something deeper. In a diner in Ohio, a waitress played the clip from her phone on repeat during her lunch break, wiping her eyes in the back corner booth. "I don't even like politics," she said, but this felt like someone finally said something real. In the background of the online storm, something unexpected happened. A small local newspaper in West Virginia, the Hollow County Register, ran a Sunday editorial titled "The Boy Who Listened." It didn't mention JD by name until the last paragraph. It simply talked about how once a student came through their school with broken shoes and a quiet gaze, and how now the country was finally listening back. The backlash came like a wave at low tide, quiet then cruel. Within 48 hours of the hashtags exploding, opposition operatives mobilized. It began with whispers on anonymous forums. Then came the podcasts, the cable segments, the carefully timed op-eds. J.D. Vance wasn't brave, they said. He was reckless, unstable, too emotional to lead. One segment ran a loop of J.D.'s childhood truck photo alongside ominous music, asking, "Do we really want trauma driving our policy?" But the lowest blow didn't hit J.D. directly. It hit his mother. In a clip circulated on social media, a conservative radio host sneered, "Let's not forget who raised him, or rather, who didn't. An addict is an addict no matter what her son becomes. You can't scrub that out with a Senate speech." The words stung, not just for JD, but for every person who'd grown up in the shadows of addiction, who had fought their way to the light and still carried the weight of that darkness. JD didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. Others did it for him. A retired Marine from North Carolina posted a grainy video from his front porch. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I don't know Senator Vance personally, but I know the war he came from. I've seen that same stare in the eyes of men who crawled out of foxholes and into courtrooms, trying to keep their kids. This country's full of survivors. We fight for men like him." That video hit 3 million views in less than a day. Next came a nurse from Dayton, whose brother died of an overdose in 2012. She posted a photo of JD's mother from a local support group taken years ago. "She was there," the caption read, "trying, always trying. Don't you dare shame the ones who fought demons just so their kids could stand tall." Allies rose across the spectrum. A former judge tweeted, "We don't choose the wounds we're born with, but we do choose what we do with them." J.D. Vance made his scars into service. A preacher from Alabama aired a Sunday sermon about resilience, quoting J.D.'s now famous line, "I'm still that boy," just with a microphone now. Even Jasmine noticed the shift. In her office, a young intern quietly slid a tablet in front of her. The screen played a short documentary, unedited, raw, about JD's upbringing, his mother's rehabilitation journey, the janitor who gave him a coat, and the truck he once called home. It ended not with JD speaking, but with a silent clip of him kneeling at his mother's grave. No music, no narration, just stillness. Jasmine didn't say a word. Her chief of staff glanced at her, hesitant. "Do you think the attacks will break him?" She shook her head slowly. "They'll only clarify who he's standing for." Meanwhile, back in JD's home district, dozens of people gathered outside a small food pantry where his mother used to volunteer during her final years. They brought candles, photos, folded letters. Not because she was perfect, but because she mattered. Because in her son's voice, they heard the echo of someone who had climbed out of pain and chose to speak for others still trapped in it. Even the headlines began to shift. From survivor to symbol, J.D. Vance and the fight for forgotten voices. When they attacked his mother, America pushed back. It became clear the smear campaign had miscalculated. They thought shame would silence him. Instead, it amplified the exact reason people listened in the first place. J.D. wasn't offering perfection. He was offering proof that pain didn't disqualify someone from leading. It might just be the reason they should. It started with a single online petition, then 20, then 200. Within a week, over 1 million signatures poured in from across the country. The ask was simple but urgent. Identify the voice on the tape, not just to satisfy curiosity, but to confirm a growing suspicion that what J.D. Vance had exposed was far more than rhetoric. It was a breach of duty, of democracy, of trust. Cable networks debated the ethics of disclosure. Pundits speculated. One even suggested J.D. had faked the entire thing, until a linguist from MIT came forward to verify the audio's authenticity. The crowd didn't want drama. They wanted truth, and the pressure grew. What had begun as a moment of political theater had become something else, a movement that didn't wear party colors. It was stitched together by veterans in Ohio, single mothers in Georgia, retired teachers in Nebraska. They weren't chanting slogans. They were sending emails, making calls, showing up at town halls with copies of the transcript in trembling hands. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett found herself in a part of the country she hadn't visited in years. A small Appalachian town JD had once quietly helped after a factory shutdown. No media had been invited, no ribbon cut, but people remembered. She stepped into a modest community center where a daycare had been restored thanks to redirected federal funds JD had fought for behind the scenes. A woman in a faded Marshall University sweatshirt offered Jasmine coffee. No hostility, just curiosity. "You here to talk about the tape?" she asked. Jasmine nodded. The woman leaned in, voice low. "He never said much, but he showed up. That counts." As Jasmine made her way through the center, she noticed a young girl sitting in the corner, coloring with fervent focus. The girl looked up and smiled shyly, then walked over with a folded drawing, a picture in crayon, a tall man with glasses handing a hard hat to a bearded worker. Below it, scrawled in messy print, "Mr. JD gave Daddy his job back." Jasmine held the paper in both hands. Something in her shifted, not broken, but realigned, like a compass clicking back into place. Later that evening, she sat in a quiet green room at CNN. A makeup artist dabbed lightly at her cheek. A producer asked if she wanted to avoid the question about JD. She said no. The countdown began. 5 seconds. 3. Live. The anchor welcomed her. Questions circled about party division, digital unrest, the swelling petition movement. Then came the moment. "Representative Crockett," the host said, "you've reviewed the tape. The public wants answers. Do you stand by JD Vance's claims?" Jasmine took a breath. "I disagree with JD Vance on many things," she said, her voice calm but clear. "But I believe him." A pause fell, the kind that doesn't drop like a bomb, but settles like a blanket. Across America, on couches and stoops and bar stools, people leaned closer to the screen. Not because she'd sided with him, but because she'd spoken like someone who wasn't afraid to stand next to the truth. And sometimes that was louder than a vote. The marble halls that once felt distant to JD Vance now pressed in like a slow-closing vice. The calls had started early, first in private meetings, then in veiled press statements. "He's become a distraction," one senator told a reporter. "He's dividing the party." Behind closed doors, donors threatened to pull support. A few called it patriotism run wild. Others labeled it ambition cloaked in populism. JD listened to all of them and said nothing, until the moment they asked him to resign. A staffer placed a letter on his desk, unsigned but clearly circulated through back channels. It was polite, almost clinical. It spoke of unity, decorum, party strength, but the subtext was unmistakable. Walk away and do it quietly. JD folded the paper in half, then once more. He slid it into his desk drawer, shut it, and stood up without a word. The final hearing had been scheduled for weeks, but now it felt like the last chance to speak while the country still cared. Every major network cleared airtime. Schools streamed it in classrooms. Restaurants switched off music and turned up the volume on old televisions mounted in corners. Jasmine Crockett entered the chamber 10 minutes early, a thick folder in hand, face unreadable. JD arrived exactly on time. He didn't look to either side. He took his seat at the center, adjusted his microphone, and waited. The gavel fell. The room didn't buzz. It held its breath. One by one, committee members delivered their preambles. Some struck chords of caution, others leaned into cynicism, but none dared to dismiss the moment outright. They all knew. This wasn't just about the voice on the tape anymore. It was about whether integrity could still survive inside these walls. JD was called to speak. He stood slowly, clearing his throat as he reached for the single sheet of paper he'd carried in his breast pocket. He placed it on the table in front of him, but didn't look at it. Instead, he looked straight ahead. "I've been called a traitor," JD began, voice steady. "I've been called reckless. Some have said I embarrass my colleagues, My party. Even this institution. He paused. No dramatics, just gravity. I didn't come here to fit into marble halls. I came so no child would have to sleep in a truck again. A stir moved through the room. Not quite a gasp, but something closer to memory. JD continued, his voice quiet but unwavering. When I was 12, I watched my mother beg a gas station clerk to let us sleep in the parking lot. I told her it was an adventure. She knew it wasn't. And the man who owned that truck, my stepfather, he died last year with no health insurance, no pension, and no obituary. He glanced toward the far wall where portraits of former legislators watched silently. I didn't enter this building to be liked. I didn't come here to entertain lobbyists or exchange nods with consultants. I came here because somebody had to walk through the front door with mud still on their boots. A murmur swelled from the back rows, unspoken approval from people who hadn't applauded in years. I released that tape because it was true, and if truth ruins me, so be it. But it won't ruin this country. Not if we listen. Not if we remember who we're supposed to be. He folded his hands. Silence took the room like fog. Then slowly, one figure stood. Jasmine Crockett. She didn't speak. She just looked at JD and nodded once. A simple gesture. But it unlocked something. Another senator rose. Then another. Within seconds, nearly the entire chamber stood. Not clapping, not cheering, just standing. In reverence. In reckoning. Outside the chamber, across airports and living rooms and lunch counters, people stood too. Because sometimes truth doesn't ask for applause. It just asks you to stand with it. 3 weeks later, the bill passed. It wasn't perfect. No bill ever was. But it carried real consequences. Whistleblower protections were expanded. Campaign audit procedures reformed. And at last, an independent investigation into the voice on the tape was opened. No more speculation, no more excuses. JD didn't smile when he read the final vote tally. He simply closed the folder and let the weight of it settle. No press tour followed, no grand victory lap. Just one quiet day after another. On a fog-wrapped morning, JD returned to the school he'd once called home. The building had aged, bricks chipped, grass uncut, windows clouded with time. But one thing was new. Near the old gym doors, beneath the chipped red paint, a bronze plaque had been freshly installed. In memory of Raymond Ellis, janitor, mentor, voice. JD touched the plaque gently. For a moment, the world fell silent. "I'm still that boy," he whispered, just with a microphone now. Behind him, a group of sixth graders laughed as they passed. They didn't know who he was. And that was okay. Elsewhere, Jasmine sat in her office, overlooking the Capitol. She watched footage of the final vote replay on mute. Then, with a worn pen, she began writing the closing for her podcast. The first episode she'd narrate herself. Her voice was calm, measured, but unmistakably moved. It wasn't just a tape, it was a reckoning. Not of one man or one moment, but of a system long overdue for accountability. And America finally listened. Because courage doesn't always come wrapped in applause. Sometimes it walks in alone, speaks softly, and leaves the door open for others. She paused, then closed with the line she hadn't rehearsed. It had come to her in the hallway days earlier, uninvited but certain. Some voices whisper, others change history. This story reminds us that truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs someone brave enough to carry it. JD and Jasmine, though divided, found common ground through integrity. In a world of noise, their courage became clarity. Change often starts quietly, with one person daring to say, "This isn't right." What's one moment in your life when standing up, even silently, meant everything? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.